So the brain has 4 different regions, what we call the cerebral hemispheres. These are also called the cerebrum. And if we're looking at just hemispheres, then we have left and right hemispheres. And then we can split those hemispheres into lobes. In a right hemisphere, but then we also have frontal lobes, parietal lobes, occipital lobes, temporal lobes, and then deep to that we've got the insula. So we can also say that we've got frontal lobes, we've got parietal lobes, occipital lobes, temporal lobes, and then this region called the insula. So the cerebral hemispheres, or our cerebral cortex, is really what's in charge of our higher order processing. So things like deciding that I want to move, that's going to originate in my cerebral hemispheres. Processing sensory information also originates there. So you could say that in general, our cerebrum is responsible for higher order processing. And the frontal lobes are going to be really important for things like analysis and problem solving. This is also where your personality is located. This is also where, if you're going to make a voluntary movement, it originates from this place called the Precentral Gyrus. We'll look at that again in a minute. But in general, for our frontal lobes, we can say that this has our personality, it does our problem solving, and initiates our voluntary motor command. There are other areas of the frontal lobe that do other things. We have association areas, frontal eye field, all that stuff. I'm not going to worry about it. So that's frontal lobes. Our parietal lobes is like our somatosensory area. So it's like your sensory integration area for your general senses like pain, vibration, touch. So this would be like, we'll say it's our general somatosensory cortex. Our occipital lobes at the back of the brain is where all of our visual information comes in. So this is our primary visual cortex. Temporal lobes is where auditory information is processed. So this is our primary auditory cortex. The insula is kind of found deep here. We'll look at a picture in a minute. This is where taste is processed. That's the sense of taste is called gustation. So this is our primary gustatory cortex. So if we look, all of this big bulk of your brain that you see on the outside is your cerebral cortex. That we can again divide into our cerebral hemispheres, left and right, or into our lobes. The next part of the brain is called the Diencephalon. And it's deep to the cortex. And the Diencephalon has 3 regions that we should talk about. So if you look here on this figure, the Diencephalon is this purple part. Look on a model, it's like this region here. There's also some other limbic system stuff going on, but this region here that's kind of coming deep into here is your thalamus, which is part of it. Then our hypothalamus is down here and our epithalamus on the back. So those are the 3 regions. Don't worry, I'll write them down. So for our diencephalon, we've got the first part is kind of our frame of reference is the thalamus. And the thalamus is the sensory relay station. So any sensory information with the exception of smell that is coming into your brain is going to come through sensory neurons. They're going to synapse in your thalamus, and then your thalamus is going to ship it off to the part of the cerebrum that's responsible for processing it. So for your thalamus, we can say this is the sensory relay station for everything but smell. Epi always means upon, so we also have an epithalamus. And it's kind of, in us, it's more like kind of behind it. So if you look back here on this model, your epithalamus sits back here. The part of the epithalamus that I want you to know about is the pineal gland. So we'll talk in a little bit about what that does. And then inferior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus. And we'll talk more about what it does in a minute as well. So then the next region that you see here in green is the brainstem. The brainstem also has three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the last part of the brain is the cerebellum. It's like a mini brain that sits underneath your occipital lobes. So we'll talk more about what it does in a little bit as well. So those are our major regions: the cerebral cortex, or the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Okay, so in the central nervous system we have two types of what we call matter: gray matter and white matter. And gray matter is the unmyelinated neurons, or the somas of myelinated neurons. So gray matter is primarily somas and unmyelinated axons. White matter looks white because of myelination, so these are our myelinated axons. In general, if we look in our spinal cord, our gray matter is deep to our white matter. So all of our cell bodies are here deep, or our interneurons that are unmyelinated are in this gray matter. And then our myelinated axon tracts that are bringing information up to the brain and down from the brain are superficial to that. If we move up to our brainstem, we have kind of white matter throughout and gray matter kind of scattered throughout. And then when we get to the cerebrum, what you see all on the outside is gray matter. And then we've got these white matter tracts that run from one area of the brain to another. And then these deep nuclei. Remember we said that clusters of cell bodies in the brain were called nuclei. In the spinal, or in our peripheral nervous system, they're called ganglia. We'll talk more about that when we get back from break. Okay, so just kind of like be aware of that information. It's in your chapter, put it in your back pocket. Our ventricles are important because they are these fluid-filled spaces that are helping to give the brain buoyancy. So we can look at these models of ventricles to kind of understand what's going on. And they are located deep in our cerebral hemispheres. And they are circulating cerebrospinal fluid. So we've got two what are called lateral ventricles. They're not like 1 and 2. They're the right and left lateral ventricles. They are connected to our third ventricle through what's called this interventricular foramen. So this is our third ventricle, and then our third ventricle is connected to our fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. All of these pink areas on these models are the choroid plexus. That is where we find those ependymal cells that are making cerebrospinal fluid. So what else do you know about ventricles? I want you to be able to identify them and track cerebrospinal fluid's flow through them, because this is important. Cerebrospinal fluid does a couple things. It helps to keep the brain buoyant. If you think about it, the brain is soft tissue. And you've got this huge hole at the bottom of your skull, the foramen magnum. And if it's all this soft tissue, gravity could just pull it through that hole. So our ventricles are full of cerebrospinal fluid. It's also circulating through the central canal of your spinal cord and around your brain in your meninges. And so it helps to lighten the apparent weight of the brain and make it basically float in your skull. So we'll say our ventricles are CSF-filled spaces that contain the choroid plexus that makes CSF. And CSF is important because it makes the brain buoyant. It lightens the apparent weight of the brain so it can float. And then it also helps with ion balance and things for your interstitial fluid. So it can also help maintain ion balance. So we talked about the cerebrum and what each of the hemispheres, the lobes that they're split into. Some features that we should be aware of are what are called gyri and sulci. You only need to know about a couple specific gyri. Gyri are these raised bumps. So in our cerebrum, gyri are the raised bumps. Its singular would be gyrus. Then the shallow depressions are called sulci, or singular would be sulcus. These are shallow depressions. And then the deep depressions that we find between our hemispheres and between the cerebrum and the cerebellum are called fissures. So all of these little guys here are sulci, and then if we look between our hemispheres, that's the longitudinal fissure. And then if we put our cerebrum back in here, our cerebellum back in here, this would be the transverse fissure. So fissures are deep grooves between our lobes or between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So these are deep grooves. So here we can see our longitudinal fissure that's between our left and right hemispheres. Here we can see our transverse fissure that's between our cerebrum and our cerebellum. As far as important sulci and gyri, really the most important sulcus that you're going to have to worry about is this, what's called the central sulcus. And the central sulcus splits, it's like the dividing line between your frontal lobe and your parietal lobes. So I do want you to know about the central sulcus because this is going to help us find our precentral and postcentral gyrus. So our central sulcus is between frontal and parietal lobes. And why is it important? Because it's going to be this line of demarcation for these important gyri. All right, so if we come to, so this is facing anteriorly, in front of that central sulcus, we've got this, what's labeled red here, this red gyrus. This is called the precentral gyrus. This is where all of your voluntary motor commands originate. So if you decide to move your finger, it's coming from the precentral gyrus. So that's going to be the first important one, our precentral gyrus. And it's called the primary motor cortex. And what we can say about it is all voluntary movements originate there. I'm going to come to this homunculus to show you what's going on. So if we look at these functional areas, here is our precentral gyrus. Here's our postcentral gyrus. Our postcentral gyrus is what we call our primary somatosensory cortex. So all of the sensory information that we're aware of, like if you're hot or if you're in pain or all of that, everything that's mapping out on your body is coming in at our postcentral gyrus, which is in the parietal lobe. So our postcentral gyrus is our primary somatosensory cortex. And so this is bringing in information that are not special senses. So these are your general senses. Your special senses like vision goes to your occipital lobe. Your special sense of hearing goes to your temporal lobes. So this is just for our general senses. It's our primary somatosensory cortex. And what we can say is this is where we process our general sensory information. And so if we look at this picture here, these are showing what are called homunculi, or singular homunculus. And basically what these are is maps of the body on your precentral and postcentral gyrus. And how they discovered this is, if you're doing brain surgery, people actually have to stay awake during brain surgery. And I mean, they may like make it so that you're not conscious that you're conscious, but you are. So, and the reason they do that is because if they mess with some area that's really critical to some vital function, then you need to be able to tell them, or they need to be aware of it. So how they map this out is by, way back in the day, having all these people undergoing brain surgery, and you just start poking around and seeing what happens. And so on this red part is the primary motor cortex. So this is your precentral gyrus. And you can see it sitting up in our frontal lobes. And if they poke this region here, you wiggle your toes. If you poke this region here, you wiggle your fingers. And so they could map out the whole body onto your precentral gyrus as far as your voluntary motor commands go. And what you can see if you look at this is your face and your hands have like the most territory. So your trunk, which is way bigger than your face or your hands, has very little territory. But if you think about it, how much are you really moving your trunk? Not a lot, but your fingers you are doing a lot of movement with, a lot of fine, precise movement with. So it gets a lot of territory, your hand gets a lot of territory in your motor cortex because you have to have fine control over the movements that your hand makes. Same thing with your face. So this homunculus is the map of your body on your precentral gyrus. This one on the right is the map of your body on your postcentral gyrus. So this is your somatosensory cortex. So again, they could poke right here on your brain and you feel it on your chin. And they could poke right here on your brain and you feel it in your nose. And so, again, if you look here, you can see your face and your hand both have disproportionately large amounts of the cortex dedicated to the processing there because your sensation needs to be really fine-tuned there. So again, if we look on our back, your back and your trunk don't really need to feel with the same affinity as your hands and your face do. So your back, if you notice, like I can put two fingers right here and I can't tell that that's only coming from one spot. It's not until you get really far apart that you can feel two-point discrimination. It doesn't really matter. I could take this little thing right here and poke it on my finger and I can feel both points even though they're really close together. So it's really important to have a lot of brain territory dedicated to places like your hands and your face because this is how you're interacting with the environment. So this is kind of just showing you how that lays out on your brain. Before we move on, I'll just show you really quick this picture of the insula. If you look, if we kind of pull apart our frontal and temporal lobes, that region deep is the insula. This is where your sense of taste is processed. So taste, vision, hearing, smell, those are all special senses. Your postcentral gyrus is processing everything that's not special. Pain, temperature, pressure, vibration, stuff like that. Okay. Don't worry about like your motor association area or anything like that. We don't really have time to deal with it. Okay, so the other general consideration to be aware of about the brain, it's got these different regions that are processing different things, but this is what you were talking about. It's called contralateral, oh no, that's the next one. The hemispheres of the brain have what we call contralateral control. What this means is that the right side of your brain is sensing information coming from the left side of your body and executing motor commands that go out to the left side of your body. So contralateral means opposite side. And what this means in your brain is that your right hemisphere controls and responds to the left side of your body. The inverse is also true. Your left hemisphere controls and responds to the right side of your body. If on the test I ask you to identify, okay, what is A and what's its function, then I would want you to say that is your left precentral gyrus and its function is to initiate motor commands that will be carried out in the right side of the body. So I do want you to be aware of our contralateral control. So that would be the best answer. Now, if you said it initiates motor commands, that would be partial credit, but I mean, it's sided. The brain is sided. So I want you to be aware of that. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about this stuff. Another general consideration about the brain is that it's what we call lateralized. And that means that in 90% of individuals, one hemisphere is in control of some things, and the other hemisphere is in control of other things. So how does this work? In 90% of individuals, the left brain controls things like analysis, math, language, these kind of more analytical things, logic, all of that's handled in the left brain. In the right brain, this is where we have things like artistic ability, visuospatial processing. So in 90% of individuals, that's how it works. So I guess I'll just rewrite this. You can say for lateralization, that in 90% of individuals, and this can correspond to handedness, but it doesn't have to. So a lot of left-handed people still have their brains lateralized this way. So how does it, what is it? Our left hemisphere controls like logic, math, language, analysis. And in those 90%, then the right hemisphere is going to control like artistic ability, visuospatial tasks, intuition, emotions. In the remaining 10%, about 5% of them have the opposite lateralization, and about 5% of them have no lateralization. All right, the last general consideration to be aware of as far as your cerebrum goes is that it's in control of your conscious behavior. So things that you're thinking about, things that you're aware of. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the diencephalon. Again, it's got these three regions, the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. If we look on this figure here, we can see this is the thalamus in this light purple. The epithalamus is this region kind of posterior here. The only part I want you to worry about is the pineal gland. And then the hypothalamus is this darker purple part that's hanging down here. So our thalamus is separated into these different nuclei. And what it's doing is it's acting as our relay station. So sensory information for everything but smell is going to come in through a sensory neuron that's going to bring that information to an interneuron. That interneuron is going to synapse in the thalamus, and then we're going to send out another interneuron to take the information to the part of the cerebrum that's responsible for processing it. Smell doesn't go through the thalamus. It's processed like in an area right where memories are being formed. And so when we talk about special senses at the end of the semester, we'll go through all of that. But if you think about it, smell is one of the most potent triggers of memory. Like as far as like touch, who cares about touch? That's not going to trigger any specific memory. But if you smell some type of cookie, it could bring you right back to your grandma's kitchen 20 years ago. So it's not going through the thalamus. Everything else is. The epithalamus is, I thought I had our epithalamus next. I don't have our hypothalamus next, so let's talk about that. Our hypothalamus, it just looks like nothing important, like this little kind of weird shaped region that's hanging down from the thalamus. It is so important. It is the master controller of your autonomic nervous system. So your autonomic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that's controlling all of those things you don't have control over. Blood vessel dilation, constriction, body temperature, all of that. So in general, what we can say for the hypothalamus is it's the master controller of the autonomic nervous system, which I'm going to abbreviate ANS. It's also the master controller of the endocrine system. It's not a gland, so it's not the master gland. The pituitary is. We'll start there next semester. But it controls what's going on with the pituitary. So what is it responding to? It's responding to body temperature. It's helping with hunger, thirst. All of these things that you don't really consciously think about. Some people say that the hypothalamus is in control of the 4 F's. Fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproduction. I'll just let you imagine how that's an F. So the hypothalamus is regulating all of those things. It's very, very important. And it doesn't even look like anything significant. It's just this little thing hanging down from the thalamus. But it's really, really important. So we'll start talking about the hypothalamus again next semester. We'll talk about what it's doing as it controls the endocrine system. So it's exerting all of this control over your pituitary, which is the master gland, but that's endocrine. So it's just this group of nuclei, which again are cell bodies, that are really helping to regulate all of these autonomic functions. Then the last part of your hypothalamus is the epithalamus. The part that I want you to worry about is your pineal gland that sits back here. And what your pineal gland does is as light levels are dropping, so as the sun's going down, it becomes more active and starts releasing melatonin, which helps with sleepiness. So we'll say that the pineal gland becomes active when the sun goes down, or we'll say in low light. And produces melatonin that makes you sleepy. Our brain is the brainstem, and it's got again these 3 regions: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the brainstem is really in control of like lower level functioning and vital functions, as just like a general rule. So this is handling lower level issues. So, like our vital functions and things. Heart rate, respiration rate, all of that's going to be set in the brainstem. So, if we look at what each part is doing, the midbrain, I mean, this is very general. Again, this is central nervous system light. You can take a neuroanatomy or neurophysiology class to go into the details someday. The midbrain in general is helping to respond to visual and auditory reflexes. So reflexes are behaviors that don't go all the way up to the cerebrum before you respond. They're controlled either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. So if something like a bird flies by your head and squawks, and you follow to track it, that motion is reflexive. It's not going all the way up to your voluntary or to your primary motor cortex because you're responding to what you saw. So that is originating here in the midbrain. So this is kind of in control of auditory and visual reflexes. So the door slams and you jump. That's coming from the midbrain. And you don't have to worry about the different parts of the midbrain. All right, the next region, the pons, is it's the biggest job that I think of when I think of the pons. It helps to alter normal respiration rate if need be, if we need to increase it. It's not setting it, that's coming from the medulla, but it can help to kind of alter respiration rate if need be. And it can also help, it seems like it has an effect on what's called the reticular activating system, which is what keeps you awake. So it can help with alertness, and it alters respiratory rate. Your normal respiratory rate is set by the medulla oblongata. So it's got a respiratory center, it's got a cardiovasculatory center, and it's got what's called a vasomotor center that helps to control how dilated or constricted your blood vessels are. So the medulla oblongata is really important in helping with these vital functions. It sets your normal respiratory rate. And then it's got what we call the cardiovascular center. Your heart sets its own pace, but if we need to adjust heart rate, then that will come out of the medulla. So the cardiovascular center can alter heart rate. And we've got a vasomotor center that can alter how much constriction or dilation you have in your veins, depending on what's going on, or your blood vessels, depending on what's going on with blood pressure. So we'll just say for the vasomotor center, it controls the diameter of your blood vessels. So then the last part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is like this little midbrain hanging off of the back of your brainstem. And the cerebellum is important for making sure that everything you want to do is actually happening in the body. So its function is to line up motor output with sensory input that's kind of telling it what you're supposed to be doing. So it's coordinating your voluntary motor commands. What does this mean? Well, we've got these receptors out in our periphery called proprioceptors. You're not really aware of proprioceptors consciously. They're found in your joints and they're found in your muscles, and they tell your cerebellum basically about your place in space. Where are my limbs? So we'll say that it responds to proprioceptors. And what they are paying attention to is your place in space. What does this mean? Like limb position and level of stretch. So if we look at the cerebellum, it's hanging off the back of your brainstem. So this is our brainstem, and this is our cerebellum. And sensory information is coming into it from these peripheral receptors. So our sensory information is coming up our spinal cord through our brainstem, and then we've got these offshoots that are coming from our pons back to our cerebellum, so that the cerebellum knows where our limbs are. The other information that's coming into the cerebellum is coming down from your primary motor cortex, which is where we are initiating all of our voluntary movements. So your prefrontal or your precentral gyrus, this information is coming down, and it's going to go down your spinal cord to spinal nerves that execute those movements. But some of the information is going to go back to the cerebellum on its way down through the brainstem. And so what the cerebellum is doing is making sure that this output is lining up with this information. So that if I say I want to wiggle my right finger, then this is the command coming down from my motor cortex. It's going through my spinal cord and out to a spinal nerve that's controlling the movement. But my cerebellum is paying attention and saying, is she moving her little finger or her finger appropriately? So it's lining up your sensory output, your sensory input to your motor output. It's kind of easy to it's easier to understand what the cerebellum is doing when you think about what happens when we knock out cerebellar function. The cerebellum is one of the places that's most sensitive to alcohol. So when you get drunk, you knock out cerebellar function. This is what your roadside test is testing. So if the police officer says to you, okay, close your eyes and touch your nose, and you close your eyes, and the voluntary motor command is saying, touch my nose, but instead I touch my cheek, then my cerebellum isn't working properly. It's not able to adjust this command based on the fact that the sensory information isn't lining up. Does that kind of make sense? So when you're not drunk, if the sensory information comes back and says, no, you're coming into your cheek, your cerebellum can adjust and help you move to your nose. So that we're making sure that the output we have is in line with the information coming in. And again, it totally gets knocked out when you drink, so that it can't then adjust it, and you're wiggling all over the place, and you're falling, and you're not lining up your output with what's actually happening.